very welcome back to Curiosity Season 2, where this season we'll be looking at the technology pillars from Season 1, but incorporating them with members of the Oracle startup ecosystem. This is episode 3. If you haven't tuned in already, go back and listen to episode 1 and 2, where we explored topics such as data analytics and AI. But for this episode, we will be looking at all things infrastructure. But before we do, we're going to go to Andrei, our digital advocate. Andrei, for the person on the street, what does it all mean?
So I'm just going to be explaining some key terms that you find surrounding infrastructure. So the first term would be cloud services. A cloud service is any online service made available to users on demand from a cloud computing provider. As opposed to actually having the servers on-premise, you would have them online. Another term is digital infrastructure, the one we will be talking about today. So there are foundational services that are necessary to the information technologies capabilities of a nation, region, city, or organization. And then IaaS, which is infrastructure as a service, is just another type of cloud service where a cloud provider provides digital data centers, including servers, storage, and networking hardware.
Fantastic, Andrei. Thank you very much. So my guests for this episode are Sean Fay, co-founder and CEO of The Context Factory, a business which is driving adoption and inclusion in the workplace through technology. And I'm also joined by Simon Mullaney, a co-founder and CTO of Blockaviation, which is a global register for aircraft. Gentlemen, you're very, very welcome.
Hello.
Thank you very much for joining us today. Not much of a journey for you. We're all based in Dublin, so it's a bit of a change from our season 1 or episode 1 and 2 where we were in London. So it's great to be home for this, and really does give a validation to Dublin being a technology hub. So all things infrastructure, really. So Sean, if we start with yourself and the Context Factory, do you want to give us an idea in terms of how your business is operating within this sphere?
Yeah, certainly. So the Context Factory itself is a company making artificial intelligence for diversity and inclusion in hiring. And the roots of that is very much around data. And that absolutely links to the idea of infrastructure as a service, because if you think the current recruitment market is about a $200 billion global dollar recruitment market, and it's very much in sort of it's on CVs, it's in inboxes, it's in emails, it's absolutely disseminated all over the place, and therefore tracking progress and seeing what's going on, tracking bias and stuff like that, it's absolutely impossible. There isn't an infrastructure that binds all of that together. It's a human services business predominantly at the moment. We predict and advocate and evangelize the idea that in 10 years that will be gone. It will be materially about software services. So services that are on your preferred supplier list at the moment will turn into technology in your human capital management stack. And that is massively underlaid by the idea of the infrastructure, because it's only on that common infrastructure that you can bring all those data points together. Because if you're taking a really large human services business and transferring it into the cloud and into technology, you're going to have a really large, really high level, really smart infrastructure to underpin that. And I don't think any one technology company or any one recruitment company could build that on their own. You've got to reach out to partners that have got that infrastructure that will give you the heavy lifting and the commonality to do that. So the transformation we see in our market could only happen because of the birth of cloud and infrastructure as a service. It's going to underpin that change.
Fantastic. Simon, a very, very different business, but operating within the same kind of sphere per such, or has grown out from infrastructure, which is validation to how broad of a term it can be. Do you want to give us an insight into your business?
Yeah, of course. So Blockaviation is creating a global register for aircraft maintenance records. So the thesis behind our company is that the value of a commercial aircraft isn't in the metal, but it's in the records behind the metal. So because it's such a highly regulated industry, if you don't have the maintenance records behind an aircraft, you can't prove its value. And an aircraft will see a valuation discount of up to 80% if you don't have accurate maintenance records for that aircraft. So to that end, we're creating a global register which stores an index of where all these records are stored. So currently these records are stored in systems much like Dropbox, but for aircraft records. But each system is proprietary and has their own services. We're just creating a layer that sits on top of those systems that contains an index of where all those records are stored, plus a digital fingerprint of those records, so that we can search, retrieve, and prove authenticity of those records without actually having the records. So we operate akin to a search engine.
Fantastic. I was reading this morning a report by McKinsey, which in 2015 had, I suppose, scanned different organizations to get their viewpoint on infrastructure. And 76% of the respondents said that they would remain within a traditional infrastructure strategy. 3 years later, they decided to run that report again and found that 57% of the respondents had decided to start moving to a private cloud strategy from an infrastructure perspective. So it shows us a very rapidly moving market. How does an organization such as yours keep up with that fast pace, and has the likes of these changes from an infrastructure perspective helped you increase your pace of innovation?
Well, we started on the cloud, so it hasn't been much of an impact on our approach. All our services are hosted on the cloud, but to that extent, you can see that Amazon being the market leader, but Microsoft has such strong growth in the industry, and I think that's from all people moving from on-premise to cloud solution, and that's why the market's going to double in the next 3 years. So.
Yeah, I mean, definitely with regards to the movement to that sort of common infrastructure. Part of that, to be honest, is we are linked on progress with regards to where someone is in their HCM stack. So you can't sell or scale a meaningful transformation in HR technology unless you integrate into someone's existing human capital management software. Good luck to you if you're trying to put another thing in the boat, because there's a CIO trying to get stuff out the boat. So it's impossible. And therefore, that links into the infrastructure piece, because if people are very much tied to their applications, it's whether their applications can or can't work on a common infrastructure. So Oracle, amongst others, has an ability where it isn't proprietary in what applications can run on the infrastructure. So there is the fact that different applications can run, and that's very different. So it is the case that looking at the move to the infrastructure side of things, the real world implications are even things like GDPR. So if we're dealing with data from people in the EU, we need to know that we keep that within the EU. So there's different infrastructures that will give you different granularity with regards to where that data's kept and where that data's shared. And they're quite different when you get into the weeds with regards to those different infrastructures. So materially, that change to going more off on-prem, going into the cloud, it is tied up with the legacy of what their existing business is and where that business can go. And if you're a startup trying to transverse that and work through the waves of where you can and can't work with people, it's tough. It's quite tough because there's a lot of change at the moment, and just trying to work out where on a chessboard what you're doing lines up with the company you're dealing with is hard, because you're not going to change them into a new environment because they like your application. It's the fly on the back of an elephant doesn't direct what the elephant does. So that's a hard thing to work out. But hopefully, there's different providers coming together and actually co-working. So Microsoft and a few others now are actually working where there's a joint nature to their clouds, and that hopefully will open things up, because it isn't the idea that you've got these sort of different proprietary clouds that aren't that have different rules, if that makes sense. So hopefully that will continue and will make life easier for us.
That's a very interesting point that you did bring up as well, about it's, as a startup, kind of delivering through the value, in essence, to get somebody to speed up the change of their environment. If we do look at a value perspective, what would you pick out as the key value drivers for looking at something like infrastructure as a service within a business?
For us, the number one is security. So just materially security. So what you're looking at the moment is the idea that you're taking information which, if we say the current as-is service is the idea that I'm sending you my CV and it goes in an inbox and it's printed out and it's sitting on a recruiter's desk, and all of that's absolutely terrible. And the data could go anywhere. There's no governance or anything around that. But still, when we come in to try and replace that, we will understandably get held to a much higher standard than the as-is now, which is tough out, because you're the new thing. And I always say, well, we're better than the old thing. Why can't we just sort of be a bit better? So the really challenging for us bit is security, is the idea that if you've got data, understandably people are very interested and motivated around the security of that data because it's something personal to them. How do you protect that? So the number one thing we're asked about is security. That's the first line that comes up. And then the second one is ideas around a bandwidth. Have you got an infrastructure where if we want a version of that software to be in a low latency, the data center that's near where our people are using it, all of that type of stuff. So that's the second one, is sort of performance. The first one that materially comes up for us, it's always security.
Being within, I suppose, a security tight industry such as aviation, Simon, I would imagine that that's something you hear or face on a daily basis within your business.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we're using a DLT network that sits on top of these record stores, and essentially the reason we use that is to securely store the details of these records, plus to notarize the documents. So currently aircraft records are stored on paper, and that's the immutable hard copy. Those paper records are scanned into systems, and we notarize those digital documents so that we can mathematically prove that document hasn't changed since its date of certification. Thus, we see in the future that that will kind of circumvent the need to keep all these boxes of paper. So currently now, if you've got, there's a common analogy that we use that a few years ago a Boeing 767 was being returned in France. So aircraft went by air, as you'd expect. The records went by road, but the truck that was carrying the records got stolen, and the airline was held liable for reproducing all the records at a cost of $6 million. So why are paper records following an aircraft? Why, if they're all scanned into a system, why can't they just trust that digital scanned copy?
If we look at the point of security, from an on-premise perspective, yes, it was something that was always on somebody's mind, but GDPR really brought it to the front. It wasn't something that people talked about or questioned, really, from an on-premise perspective. But it always seems to come up when we talk about cloud. And is it that people are concerned that we cannot do security as well as a provider, as opposed to what they can do themselves on the ground?
So to me, it's nothing about technology, it's all about psychology. So exactly what you're saying with regards to the documents for the aircraft. If you look at any major court, was looking on the news the other day, there's a major court case, and there was just absolute sort of like wheelie bins of documents going in. I mean, a massive, you fill up the half of my house with the amount of documents that were going in. It's just because the law will say, well, I trust that, it's a piece of paper. But one of those wheelie bins could easily fall off. It's not as secure, but the psychology is, it's the known piece. And I think the best example I can give is if taking an example of where you're looking at autonomous cars. If today an autonomous car malfunctioned and killed someone, it would be global news. Every 20 seconds at the moment, someone dies in a car crash in the world. Every 20 seconds, if you do the stats. But that's not news. So the problem is what you're doing is you're putting a burden on the new thing that's not shared by the old thing. So that it's just the psychology piece, and it's to do with the transfer of responsibility and power. So the idea that if I'm putting something into the cloud, effectively I'm trusting another organisation. I am losing to a degree some power over that. So I've outsourced that trust. So it's the human nature. It's how we evolved. It's the idea of us stepping into new things. But I always think of that autonomous as an example, because the as is that a death every 20 seconds, but the global news will be the one person killed by an autonomous car. So it's the idea of how do we look at innovation, because we put an unfair benchmark on it, which we don't put on the as is, if that makes any sense.
Yep, no, completely agree.
That's a very, very interesting point. Sean, do you think that it's something, I suppose, we within the industry, who particularly those who are trying to sell the likes of infrastructure as a service, think it's an established market. But when you look at the likes of what McKinsey were saying, you can see it's really in its infancy. Do you think it might be driven by a fear of the unknown because it's, I suppose, so new?
Yes, human nature, innovation. I mean, the car was an invention of the problem of what do we do with horse manure. We dabble through these things, and evolution of us as a species happened over some millions and millions of years. So we're going at light speed with regards to how things are progressing, and compared to sort of how we got here as organisms. And I just think it is that piece of that outsourcing of trust. And I understand that my child had just started creche, and I had absolute conniptions of the idea of someone else looking after my baby. So I get that, to be honest. I don't think it's any different to that. And it's the idea that, you know, you're asking for validations and tests and all sorts of stuff from these people. And that makes sense. And it's just the idea that I think the conversation in a business now, and I think one of the things is that I think people that are making technology decisions in a company aren't as much about it being done in a CTO and a CIO as much as it did. You are getting calls by CEOs, by non-technical people, saying that brand aligns to me, that's where we want to go and stuff like that. And I think that's really difficult for companies like Oracle because you're very engineering mind focused. So you're sort of sitting there thinking, well, we've made the best thing. Why aren't they buying the best thing? But it's how they feel. They may feel differently, which has no connection to the actual capability. It's another brand has made them feel better.
That is a fantastic point, because if I can jump to you for a minute, Simon, as CTO within the business, how do we, or is it possible for us to open up the likes of infrastructure as a service, take it out of the technical engineering roles and start passing it down to the line of business users themselves?
Yeah, well, it's always, you know, the bridge between the technical minds and the business minds. I think it's difficult. I think that almost has to be done within the business. So, you know, focus on a problem. You need to solve that problem. You've got a technical roadmap to do it, and then your technical guys know, you know, how best to do that. You know, at the end of the day, if you've got a server in the cloud that can, you know, has a certain amount of compute and a certain amount of storage, you know, somebody who doesn't know what a server is or doesn't know what you need compute, it might be difficult to bridge that gap. Just going back to your previous comment on the infancy of the market, I think although the market's come a long way and it's, you know, easy to deploy on the cloud and you know, easy to transfer on the cloud, I think the market is going to level out. So I think, you know, competitors are going to be more balanced. I think there's going to be, I think people like Microsoft, GCP, Oracle, are all going to take market share away from Amazon, and I think it's going to ultimately, because the barriers to be able to move software from, you know, AWS to GCP to Azure, since those barriers are coming down, I think ultimately people are going to start competing on price. I think infrastructure is going to become quite like a commodity, where you pay more if you're using a server in summertime rather than if you're paying, you know, because of heating costs, rather than if you're using a server in wintertime. So yeah, it's just going to become more competitive, and you can already see this with the free credits. So if you look at AWS, they'll give you 100,000 euros in free credits. Then Azure match that, and then all of a sudden GCP come out and say, well, we'll give you 120,000. So then the benchmark becomes 120,000, and everyone has to start giving out 120,000.
Do you think people are focusing, and I say this lightly, but in a sense almost devaluing their product or their service in that sense, as opposed to focusing on an innovation aspect where we can start driving it forward and start looking at new ways in which the service can be utilised within businesses?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you know, they will be competing to be the best rather than competing to be different. And when you compete to be the best, there's always a drive on price, so the profit margin goes down. But if you compete to be different, well, then you can keep your profit margin. So if you look at airlines, for example, because it's such a highly regulated industry and because the customer can switch easily between airlines, profit margins are low, and you know, that's just the nature of the game. That will be the same in infrastructure as a service as well. If it's easy to switch between providers and there's nothing much differentiating providers, then the only thing that infrastructure providers can compete on is price, and then there'll be a price war to zero. Unless they can differentiate their product. If they can compete to be different, well, then you can keep your profit margin up.
But it really does go back to that, I suppose, university textbook where you're either on a differentiation strategy or a low-cost strategy. Everyone's trying to find the blue ocean, but have we got to a point where people are bypassing all of this and just it's the lowest common denominator, which is consumption, as opposed to, if you look at, as you said earlier as a CTO, how can we make something as complex as a commute or compute instance very user-friendly for the line of business users? And that's where we do we not need to differentiate in that sense?
So I think, and taking on board, obviously I'm not a technical person to say, but I think this will go a slightly different route. So I'm old enough to see a couple of cycles that I've gone through before. So if you think of things like Cisco, so when Cisco were trying to shift in, had a really, really cool guy that joined, a guy called Toby Burton, and he built up a thing called IBSG. And effectively what they did is they stole the lunch of the strategy consultancy businesses. And what they did is they started hiring sort of in big four partners. And the model they had there was that you got their infrastructure, which was on-premise, but you also, as a value-added service, got these really unbelievable people that came in and helped you sort of re-engineer what your business would do. I think the model for cloud, to a degree, and the bit, if I was running a cloud business, will follow that tried and tested route. So it will be about the capability of what your cloud will do, but it's going to be integrating things like consultancy, strategic advice, and it's all the value added. So it's the idea that I can get a cloud that does X, but if I get a cloud that does X, but it also comes with that person who is a strategic advisor to them, who is used to be in a massive business, that's the business that I'm trying to get off the ground. So if, I won't name any brands, but if the chief marketing officer of a massive supermarket is doing some advisory to that work, and I'm trying to get my grocery business off the ground, if I get access to that person, as well as getting into the cloud, I think that's the model it will go, because it was really successful when they brought those value-added services into pushing tin out the door that was on-prem. And I think because it worked then, I think it will still work now. And I think the interesting bit you were saying, I totally respect that, and obviously we're going to come at this from slightly different angles, but I think it will also enable innovation to come from the more non-technical people, the more creative people that are inside a business. So a really basic example would be Ford, as an innovator in the motor business, invented, to a degree, you can't see me doing air quotes on radio, but things like the single block engine. Now, he didn't know how to do that. He just kept on saying to his engineers, do it. And they kept on failing. And he said, I'm not interested in why you're failing, just do it. He invented the assembly line that moved to people. So before him, a person was making a car, and they had to walk around and get the parts. So he electrified, I think 1903 or 1904, I can't remember exactly the date, he electrified that process. So people came to him, the Model T4 dropped in price by about 40%, and you've got the absolute birth and popularity of cars. So I think it gives the scope for people who don't have to get into the weeds of how things are done to say, I need this and I need that, and the infrastructure's got to bear the innovation of how that works. But this is what I need as someone who's on the business side of things. And I think that's the really exciting thing about infrastructure as a service, that innovation can come from people that don't share all the boxes of exactly how everything works, but you can work with your technical people, but also put a real pressure on your partner to say, look, I need this to do this, and I need it to do that, and you need to go off and solve that problem if you want my business.
I actually agree with that. So, if, the different cloud providers target different markets, different market segments. So, some people want consulting that come with your computing. Some people want you to help them deploy onto the cloud. Whereas, some other cloud providers are just going to give you your instances. You have to do everything yourself. So there are different parts of the market that they can go for. But that is, they're going to be competing to be different then.
Correct.
Rather than, everyone providing the baseline service and then competing on price, which doesn't even benefit the consumer, because as you say, there's different market segments who some people want a different product.
Massively. The jam will be enterprise. That's the thing everyone's going to chase, isn't it? How do I get as many of the Fortune 500, the Fortune, FTSE 100? It's those large users, but also then working out backing the right people that, getting the next Uber or getting those types of organisations onto your books as well. And that's quite difficult, because I don't think you can just back, or, I won't name, so, if you're a FTSE 100 and you're in the cigarette business, maybe that's not a horse to back for the long term. But therefore, I think that's the most difficult thing if you're running a cloud business, is working out your runners and riders. Who are the people that are there now? So that's business you can go after today, but who is the next really breakthrough organisation, and how do you back them early? Because what you're doing is you're potentially baking in all of their success, all of their growth. But how do you work out who to back? That's tough. That's a really tough decision.
It's funny, because as you're talking, I'm thinking of the saying that it's early adopters reap the biggest rewards, because they use the technology, can feed back their ideas, and organisations can innovate as a result of that. There slightly is a lack of that if we start looking within the sector, which I think does boil down to the education and the enablement more so of using it as providers infrastructure as a service. What ways, you had mentioned consulting and incorporating different elements within the business from that provider, but what ways, are there other ways in which they can really become more customer focused from an innovation perspective when we start looking at developing the services further?
So there's core functionality. So like I'm probably not going to get to name, but I know which cloud providers do or don't allow you to turn off where the data is from the EU and stuff like that. So for our business, when we were looking at cloud, there were people who we couldn't work with because they just wouldn't enable us to be GDPR compliant. So we're dead. So there's core capabilities, so there's understanding those core capabilities. But I think there's a true point when you get to that level of scale that, you know, if you've got someone who's opening a data center every 30 days, I think there's a level of, you know, we're not doing high frequency trading. So that if there's a latency of a couple of seconds, do you know what I mean? So that there's a group of customers that have a really crazy out finite need, but I think they're right. I think they're relatively small. So therefore, you get down to a sort of base level of competency, base level of capability, which I think will become the standard. And again, I always go back to other innovations, but things like ABS braking, lots of different things that are in every single car were in the S-Class Mercedes. So it went into the S-Class Mercedes and disseminated out into everywhere else. And I think cloud is going to be a little bit like that, but therefore, why do you still potentially buy that Mercedes against the other ones that have got all the infrastructure? It's after service, it's how you make the brand, how it makes you feel, how it makes you look, all of the other different stuff. And I don't know if that's definitely different to where this might go with regards to the cloud side of things, but I think that advisory piece, things like marketplace, so you might want to go onto someone's cloud and work with an organisation because they're a throughput to a certain group of customers. So for us, Oracle is still the largest provider of human capital management software in the world. So that's a door into customers. So there's loads of strategic reasons why you pick a partner, not just the infrastructure. And I think what the companies have to do is line up how those strategic points, but also react to each customer. So as an organisation, what we do is we build a dynamic engagement of someone on a one-to-one level. So we're materially, when our software reaches out to someone to engage them, it's not about the group they're in, it's the individual they are. So our focus is always around how do you engage individuals. And I think the tough thing to do is companies go to market with a sector view, but sectors are massively different. Technically, you're in finance if you're a two-person fintech, or if you're Barclays Bank. My God, they're different organisations and they have different needs. So it's working out beyond a sectorial view, what is this customer in front of me? How do things fit around them? And then the really difficult bit is how do you get a massive multinational juggernaut like Microsoft or Oracle or IBM, how do they get around the idea of being focused around a customer and not focused around themselves? And that's super tough.
And what do they want today, and what do they want next year and 2 years down the line? So we're using quite a new framework. So we're using, as I said, a DLT framework. So the infrastructure for that deployment had to all be developed. It's only a new ecosystem. So when we were looking at cloud providers, we couldn't use every cloud provider because every cloud provider didn't have the service. Now Oracle was one of those cloud providers that betted on the future of this technology and had, in my opinion, the best infrastructure available to deploy this. Now we did use other cloud providers, just to name off a few. IBM's pricing model didn't suit us. Other cloud providers, they were in their infancy in terms of what you could do on their infrastructure. So you could only have networks that were quite confined in resource. So I think also when it comes to cloud computing, once you get the customer, once they build their technology on your infrastructure, generally they stay there. It can be quite difficult to move, although as I say that, barriers to moving are getting lower. So it is easier to achieve.
In Ireland, they say I think you're 3 times more likely to get divorced than change your bank. So there is that legacy that once you're in, people stick.
Yeah.
Are there any areas within the industry itself that you see hold a lot of value but we're not taking advantage of as consumers, not so much as providers, but as consumers of infrastructure as a service?
To go on the GDPR front, I know of a company that's creating an API to take personal information and store it securely. I don't see why a cloud provider couldn't do something like that. Maybe they could acquire them. Maybe they, but everybody's got that problem. Everyone needs to store GDPR compliant data, or if you do, why not make it easy? Why not just build it into your infrastructure?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's what keeps me up at night is the pain of the legacy. It's the pain of what we have at the moment. So as Irish taxpayers, I think everyone in this room is an Irish taxpayer, we spend €40,000 an hour every day, every week, every month on recruitment services for the HSE. And right now we have an emergency on healthcare, and predominantly it's around the availability of talent and resourcing and financing. But you've got an organisation that's hemorrhaging that, and 40,000, do the maths. So,
we'll be careful now, because we won't be a political platform right now.
But I know, but I'm not saying it in relation to any that this is a international problem. I've worked on this in the NHS. I had a client of mine that was a Centre for Workforce Intelligence, so this is something I've been close to for years. So there's nothing around the Irish infrastructure about that. This is just common. But the point is, those human services, the legacy of those services has a material cost. One of the biggest things, and this is an issue in every healthcare system, is the certainty that the consultant sitting in front of you is the person that's actually got the qualifications to treat you. That is blockchain. The idea of the authentication of the person that's sitting in front of you is a relatively straightforward thing to do. The difficult part of that is getting to the incumbent suppliers that are comfortable sitting on pieces of paper. And it relates to your business. There's a commonality with regards to the records piece. Those records have a material effect on the price of the airplanes you were speaking about, but those records and tracking those records have a view on the authenticity of the person treating me. Is the person qualified to treat me? And that's something which is in the US system, in the NHS, in the HSE. There's no country politics behind that. But how do we get organisations to open up to the idea of making that jump? If I was to go to the cloud, maybe there'd be a leak, and maybe that this and the data would get out. But I don't think there's a true comparison to. But what is the as is? What is the business as moment? What's the current status? Because I think there's an unfair test put on the idea of innovation, because we're saying if it's not perfect, we can't do it. Well, nothing's perfect. Is it better? I think that's the thing we're trying to get to people, is the idea is that you should ask the question, is it better? Not is it perfect? 'Cause what's perfect? Nothing's perfect.
Very valid point. If we fast forward 5 years down the road, I'm going to look to yourselves as thought leaders within your respective industries. Where are we going with infrastructure as a service, and how can we see the landscape evolving?
Personally, I'm going to stick on the same vein. I think I'm going to think that other competitors are going to take market share away from AWS. That will continue to do so. The largest growth is currently coming from Microsoft, obviously, because so many enterprise clients use Microsoft architecture. It just makes sense to move to a Microsoft cloud. I do think that there is, players are going to differentiate themselves in certain ways, but I think the majority of their offerings are going to be similar, and thus will compete on price. So there'll be more value for the consumer on the standard offerings, and then the cloud providers will differentiate in different ways. Some might go towards low latency computing, some might go towards DLT frameworks, some might go to AI and robotics and AR, or what you like. But the standard offerings like compute, like storage, like big data, I can only see them competing on price.
So you don't see any big innovations coming down the road?
We're currently using a big innovation, so it's so we use a DLT framework, as I said, Hyperledger. It's quite a complex infrastructure deployment that all cloud providers have had to do. So that has been something new that cloud providers have had to adopt. Has been difficult for them? Not really, and a lot of them have adopted it quite quickly. Okay, it's been a number of years, but I would suspect, and now Oracle are in front and IBM are in front at the minute, Azure are behind, and then you've got laggards like GCP and AWS. But in 2 years, I can see the offering largely being standard across platforms, and then what do they compete on? Because all of them are using open source code from Hyperledger. So how do you compete? You're deploying it. So you deploy it one way, and they deploy it the exact same way. It's a different platform. How do you differentiate? It's only on price.
Very good. Sean, I'm sure you'll have some
Well, I think
good ideas or visions.
Yeah, I mean, I'd go back to the idea that I genuinely think it will be the value-added service. So it will be, tin/cloud plus stuff 2.0. So that model worked well, and you can go and check out the people that I mentioned, the work they did, but they really helped that organisation make an absolute step change in performance. I think the second thing will be there'll be much more focus around data. So it's the idea of the data, particularly proprietary data that you own. So I always give a really good example is a company called Foursquare. So it's the idea that the check-in company. So they had a relatively innocuous consumer business where you could turn up in a 5-story building in New York and it knew whether you were on the second floor in the coffee shop or the top floor in the record store. And they're the only people that knew that because they have your GPS locations, your infrastructure to the Wi-Fi code. They know that. No one else knows that. Now, they have a new CEO that's come in and has absolutely transformed the business into a business-to-business company because he said, hang on a second, we're the people in the world that know best where someone is in relationship between the physical world and the online world. This is powerful stuff, and it is unbelievably powerful stuff. But it's the idea that what they had built up was a proprietary data set that other people didn't have. And I think that's where, as an organisation, where our primary focus is at the moment is how do we get an insight so we can get data on diversity, so we can actually capture data by listening to people and understanding what they're telling you, people are talking to you, and how you can capture and own that. So I think the future of the infrastructure as a service, for me, is about people that can help me innovate towards how to do that. That's part the infrastructure, it's part potentially maybe using services, partner with them on a range of different stuff. And I think if you can put that sort of a pattern of services together for around a customer, that's where you're going to win. And I think different customers, like 100% what you said, are going to come with different requirements. But I think up at the enterprise or scaling startup bit, I think they're going to come potentially to say, I want all of the nuts and bolts of what your infrastructure does, and then now let's talk about above the line, what else are you going to do for me? And I think that's where the competition will be. You have to be competent in the nuts and bolts, but also tell me about the jam that's on top. And I think that's where the market will go. It's where it went last time, and I can't see any reason why it won't do the same.
Fantastic. Gents, it has been very interesting for me at least, so thank you very much for bringing your knowledge to the table. We are quickly approaching the end of our time, but before we do go, anything exciting about your business coming up that you'd like to share or make public?
Well, just on the Oracle notes, and we're currently doing a proof of concept with Oracle as a high-performance startup. So next week, our proof of concept will be going live. So our API will be going live, and you can register at Blockaviation/register. So that's exciting.
Fantastic.
Sure.
Yeah, I think for us, the thing that's really powerful is that it's been a slow walk with regards to getting people to focus on technology around diversity and inclusion, but the law is coming. So there's loads of different legislation coming in different geographies that mean that there is a base level of diversity companies have to have, and if you don't, you're going to get sued. So like Senate Bill 826 puts a requirement on any company that's headquarters in California, such as Oracle or Microsoft or Facebook, that you have to have a minimum level of diversity. So what we're saying to people is you need to get your head around this idea of this change that's coming, because if you don't, you're into legal requirements and the fact that it's about compliance, and the politicians are bored of waiting for progress. So do it before you're told.
Well, fantastic. Well, to my guests, Sean Fay, co-founder and CEO of The Context Factory, and Simon Mullaney, co-founder and CTO of Blockaviation. Gentlemen, thank you very, very much. And to you, our listeners, thank you very much. And join in to our next episode, where we will be looking at blockchain. But for the moment, from Owen and Sound, Andrei, our digital advocate, and from me, Conor Warde, thank you very much.